I still remember the glow of fairy lights weaving through the reception hall, the soft clinking of champagne glasses, and the warm hum of conversation. It was supposed to be a celebration, a night wrapped in love and family pride. But in the space of a breath, the air turned cold. My sister's voice cut through the music, sharp, public, undeniable. "Ethan, get out. I don't want you in my photos. You don't belong here." Laughter faltered. Heads turned. And I stood there frozen, feeling the weight of 100 curious eyes. I'd like to tell you this moment came out of nowhere, that it was some rare, impulsive outburst. But it wasn't. It was the final act in a story that had been playing out for years. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 36 years old. I have a modest but comfortable life, 2 homes I worked hard to own, and a love for evenings spent grilling with friends on my back porch. I don't have millions, but I have peace. Or at least I thought I did, until that night pulled every hidden hurt into the open. My sister Madeline is 4 years younger, and if you asked her, she'd tell you she was born to be part of a higher world. Designer shoes, even if they came from a clearance rack. Instagram photos at rooftop bars, whether she ordered a full meal or just a salad. Everything about her life was curated to look perfect. And for as long as I can remember, I didn't fit into that picture. I wasn't embarrassed about my jeans and boots, my secondhand truck, or the life I built with my own hands. But for Madeline, my existence didn't match her version of elegance. Our parents, Richard and Elaine, were caught in the middle, though somehow Madeline always seemed to land on her feet with their blessing. She's the youngest, Mom would say. We have to understand her. And maybe I tried to believe that for a while. But the truth was, there had been a quiet erosion in our relationship for years, each small slight carving away at the bond siblings are supposed to share. That night at her wedding, it wasn't just a rupture. It was the point where the dam finally broke. When she told me to leave, I didn't argue. I didn't shout back or demand an explanation. I simply stepped away, my hands steady, my face calm even as my chest tightened. In moments like that, you can feel 2 versions of yourself wrestling inside, one that wants to lash out and one that knows silence can speak louder. I chose the latter. But as I walked out into the cool night air, I knew something had shifted. This wasn't going to be forgotten, and it wasn't going to be forgiven, not easily. The moment still plays in my mind like a scene from a movie I never agreed to star in. I was standing near the back of the reception hall, nursing a glass of sparkling water, when my name rang out across the room. "Ethan, get out. I don't want you in my photos. You don't belong here." At first I thought she was joking, a sisterly jab meant to get a laugh. But then the music stopped, the chatter faded, and every head turned. My feet felt rooted to the spot, as if the polished wooden floor had swallowed me whole. I wish I could tell you it was just an awkward misunderstanding, a moment that could be brushed off with a laugh later. But the truth was heavier than that. Madeline's words carried a history, years of small dismissals, subtle jabs, and reminders that in her eyes, I was never enough. The way she said it, sharp and deliberate, was like she was finally saying aloud what she had hinted at for years. It wasn't about the photos. It was about erasing me from her carefully curated world. The guests didn't know what to do. Some avoided my eyes. Others looked at me with a mix of pity and curiosity. In that kind of public humiliation, you're not just embarrassed, you're exposed. Every flaw you think you have feels magnified under the weight of all those stares. I could almost hear the unspoken questions in the air. What did he do? Why would she say that? In American culture, where weddings are meant to be showcases of family unity, this was the kind of fracture you can't hide with a smile. I stayed calm, not because I wasn't hurt, but because I knew my reaction would either make this moment worse or help me keep my dignity. I've seen people in similar situations at work, at family gatherings, lose control in front of an audience. Once a coworker exploded in a meeting after being insulted by his manager. The outburst might have been justified, but the shouting is what everyone remembered. I didn't want my legacy from this night to be anger. I wanted to leave with my head high, even if my heart felt low. The lesson I took from that moment was simple but powerful. Sometimes the best defense against cruelty is composure. You can't control how someone treats you, but you can control how you respond. That night I chose to walk away rather than give her more ammunition. But walking away didn't mean forgetting. If anything, it gave me the space to think clearly, to see the years behind us in sharper focus. And that clarity would lead me straight into the next chapter of this story, the one where the quiet brother finally decided to stand his ground. Madeline and I grew up under the same roof, but it often felt like we lived in different worlds. I was the older brother who found joy in simple things, fixing up an old truck grilling burgers on a Sunday, catching a baseball game with friends. My clothes weren't flashy, but they were clean and comfortable. Madeline, on the other hand, seemed to be born with an appetite for sparkle. She wanted life to look like a magazine cover. If it wasn't elegant, it wasn't worth her time. We weren't enemies, but we weren't exactly walking the same path either. I learned early that her sense of worth was tied to appearances. She'd save for weeks to buy a pair of designer heels on clearance, but wear them like they were fresh off the runway. She'd post perfectly posed photos at rooftop bars, even if all she ordered was a single cocktail she nursed all night. I remember once inviting her to a backyard BBQ I hosted. She stayed for 20 minutes, long enough to comment that paper plates ruined the vibe before leaving for someplace nicer. It stung, but by then, I was used to it. The truth is, in families, different values can feel like different languages. I spoke the language of comfort and authenticity. She spoke the language of image and perception. Neither is wrong on its own, but when one person treats their way as superior, the gap between you widens. In American culture especially, where status symbols can dictate social circles, that gap can feel like a canyon. Our parents tried to bridge it, but every effort was like tossing pebbles into a river gone before they could make a difference. I can still see moments when she could have chosen kindness but didn't. Like the time we both attended a friend's wedding, and she introduced me as just my brother he works with, I think, houses or something. I manage properties, but she couldn't be bothered to say that. It wasn't a slip of memory, it was her way of downplaying me. These moments built up like layers of dust on an old shelf. You stop noticing them every day, but eventually you realize how heavy they've made the air you breathe. What I've learned from this is that shared blood doesn't always mean shared understanding. And if you're not careful, resentment can grow quietly until one day it's the only thing left in the room. I didn't want that for us, but I also couldn't keep pretending it wasn't there. That's why when the wedding invitation conversation finally happened, I knew it was going to be a turning point. What I didn't know was how quickly that turn would come, or how much it would change the course of our relationship forever. Our parents, Richard and Elaine, were the steady center of our childhood, though not always in the way I wished. Dad was quiet, the kind of man who could fix a leaky faucet or mend a broken fence without saying much. He believed actions spoke louder than words, and he lived by that. Mom, on the other hand, wore her emotions on her sleeve. She was quick to hug, quick to comfort, and just as quick to take Madeline's side when things got tense. "She's the youngest," Ethan, Mom would say, as if that explained everything that followed. It wasn't that they didn't love me, I knew they did. But there was a pattern, one that tilted the balance every time a disagreement arose. If Madeline snapped at me, Mom would smooth it over by telling me to let it go. If she asked for help, Dad might grumble about responsibility, but in the end the answer was yes. I remember once Madeline borrowed Dad's old pickup to move a couch, returned it with a dent in the side, and somehow I ended up helping pay for the repair. No one could quite explain why. In American families, there's a term people sometimes use: the golden child. It's the sibling who can do no wrong, the one parents defend, even when the facts say otherwise. I wouldn't have called Madeline that when we were young, but looking back, the signs were all there. Every story had her at the center, every decision seemed to bend around her comfort. Meanwhile, I became the reliable one, expected to adapt, to forgive, to make things work without complaint. That's a role that sounds noble, but wears you down over time. The cost of that imbalance isn't always obvious at first. You think you're keeping the peace when in reality, you're just swallowing your own voice. I saw it in small ways, like never speaking up when she interrupted me or letting her take credit for something I'd done. And the more you let it happen, the more it becomes the norm. I once read that family dynamics are like well-worn paths in the woods. Even if you want to walk somewhere new, your feet keep finding the old trail. I knew that feeling all too well. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that harmony built on silence doesn't last. You can only bend so far before something breaks. I kept telling myself that one day we'd find a middle ground, that she'd see me as more than just the brother who could be taken for granted. But that hope was starting to fade. And when the wedding announcement came, followed by the words that I wouldn't fit at her big day, I realized we weren't just walking different paths, we were living in entirely different worlds. The next part of this story would make that painfully clear. It was a Sunday afternoon at my parents' house, the kind of day that smelled like roasted turkey and fresh bread. Dad was carving the meat while Mom fussed over side dishes. Madeline arrived late as usual, sweeping in with a smile like she owned the room. We made small talk over mashed potatoes, and for a moment it felt almost normal. Then she tapped her glass with a fork, the soft chime pulling everyone's attention. "I have an announcement," she said, eyes sparkling. "I'm getting married." Mom's hands flew to her face. Dad stood to hug her, and the room filled with excitement. I congratulated her sincerely. Whatever differences we had, I wasn't going to spoil her moment. But before I could even take another bite, she turned to me with that practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "Ethan, don't be offended," she began, "but I don't want you at the wedding." The words landed with the same weight as a slammed door. My fork paused midair. Mom's smile faltered. Dad frowned, waiting for her to explain. And she did quickly, casually, like she was just stating a fact about the weather. "You just don't fit the kind of wedding I'm planning," she said, swirling her wine. "It's nothing personal, I just don't want my friends or my fiancé's family to get the wrong impression." It was the kind of sentence that makes your chest tighten, not because you don't understand, but because you understand exactly what's being implied. In her mind, my presence would tarnish the image she'd worked so hard to polish. I'd been many things in my life, but I'd never imagined I could be considered a liability at my own sister's celebration. Mom was the first to speak, her voice soft but firm. "Madeline, he's your brother. Family belongs at a wedding." Dad nodded, adding, "This isn't right." But Madeline rolled her eyes as if we were overreacting. "Fine," she sighed. "You can come, just wear something decent. And please don't expect to be in the photos." The table went quiet again. I nodded once, not trusting myself to speak. Sometimes silence is the only way to keep from saying something you can't take back. We moved on to other topics, but the taste of the meal was gone for me. Looking back, I think that moment taught me more than I realized. People will tell you who they are not always through their grand gestures, but through the little ways they make you feel small. Madeline's request wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about control, about shaping her world so it reflected only what she wanted to see. And I knew deep down that this wouldn't be the last time she'd try to erase me from her picture. I just didn't know then how far she'd be willing to go, or how much further I'd be pushed before I finally pushed back. A few days after that awkward family lunch, my phone buzzed with Madeline's name. She rarely called unless she wanted something, and her voice confirmed it immediately. "Ethan, I need a favor." She began skipping any pleasantries. She explained that after the wedding, she and her fiancé Daniel would have nowhere to live. "All our money is tied up in the wedding and honeymoon," she said, as if that were a perfectly reasonable choice. "Could we stay in your rental house? I know it's empty right now." She spoke like it was a given, not a request, and I felt that familiar tug between resentment and obligation. I thought about the small 2-bedroom home I'd worked years to pay off. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, and renting it out brought in steady income. Still, a part of me hoped this could be a step toward mending things between us. Maybe if I helped her now, she'd start to see me differently, so I agreed rent-free at least until they got on their feet. "Perfect," she said quickly. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "Oh, and remember, please don't be in the wedding photos. It's just the vibe I'm going for." Her words stung even though I'd heard them before. It wasn't just about the pictures, it was the message underneath: "You're not part of the image I want to project." I've seen similar situations in other families, help being accepted freely, but respect withheld in return. Like a friend of mine who lent his brother money for a car, only to hear him later mock his cheap taste in front of others. When people show you they value what you can give more than who you are, the relationship is already on uneven ground. Madeline moved in quickly, filling the house with new furniture, glossy curtains, and lamps that looked like they belonged in a showroom. She never asked my opinion, never mentioned gratitude. It was as if the house was already hers, a blank canvas for her to paint over. I kept quiet, telling myself it wasn't worth starting a fight. But each time I stopped by, I noticed little signs, a look, a comment that reminded me she still saw me as less than. Sometimes kindness isn't met with connection, it's met with entitlement. The lesson I started to see was this: generosity without boundaries can become an invitation for someone to take more than you can give. I wanted to believe helping her would close the distance between us, but in truth, it seemed to widen it. And as the wedding day drew closer, I began to feel a quiet unease, the sense that I was setting myself up for a fall. I didn't know yet how sharp that fall would be, but it was coming, and it would happen under the bright lights of her perfect day. The morning of the wedding, I stood in front of my mirror longer than usual. I'd bought a simple navy suit just for this day, not expensive but clean and well-fitted. I knew I wouldn't be in the photos, but I wanted to show respect for the occasion. Walking into the venue, I saw the chandeliers casting soft light over white roses and gold-trimmed place settings. Madeline looked stunning in her dress, and for a fleeting moment I thought maybe things would be fine. But her eyes barely met mine before she turned away, already wrapped in conversations that didn't include me. The ceremony itself was beautiful vows spoken under an arch of flowers, soft music playing in the background. I sat in the last row, content to stay out of the spotlight. Afterward, the reception began, laughter and clinking glasses filling the air. I chatted with a few relatives, careful to avoid anything that might draw Madeline's attention. Then came the call for family photos. I stayed near the back, remembering her request. That was until my Uncle Samuel spotted me and called out, "Ethan, get over here, your family. You belong in these." He pulled me toward the group before I could protest. The photographer snapped several shots, everyone smiling. I thought perhaps Madeline hadn't noticed until she did. From across the room, I heard her voice sharp enough to cut through the music. "What is he doing in the photos?" Her face flushed red as she stormed toward us. Guests turned, the chatter faded, and the room seemed to shrink. "I told you not to be in them. You've ruined everything." Her words hit me like a slap. Not because of their content, I'd heard worse, but because they were delivered in front of everyone, stripping away any chance of dignity. I tried to explain, telling her Uncle Samuel had insisted. But she wasn't listening. "I don't care. Get out. Now." She waved to the security staff like she was excusing a disruptive guest at a gala. In moments like that, you realize public humiliation isn't just about embarrassment, it's about power. I've seen it in other places too. At work, a manager once dressed down a colleague in front of the whole team. Not to correct a mistake, but to make an example of them. It's less about fixing the problem, more about reminding everyone who's in control. As the guards approached, I felt the heat rise in my chest, but kept my voice calm. There's a choice in moments like this: lash out and confirm the narrative they've built about you, or walk away and keep your composure. I chose the latter, stepping outside into the cool night air. The hurt was deep, but it was joined by something else, a quiet resolve. I didn't know exactly what I'd do next, only that I couldn't let this slide. And that thought followed me steady and sharp into the hours after the party ended. I drove for nearly an hour after leaving the reception, letting the road unwind my anger into something sharper resolve. The more I replayed the scene, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about one bad night. It was years of being treated as an afterthought of my kindness, being mistaken for weakness. I pulled over, stared at the steering wheel, and decided I wasn't going to let her start her new life in a house I had worked for. If she wanted to erase me from her perfect picture, I could erase her access to what I had built. That night, I called a friend who worked as a locksmith. He didn't ask questions, just said he'd be there within the hour. While I waited, I reached out to 2 other friends who owed me favors. "I need help moving some furniture tonight," I told them. By the time the locksmith arrived, we had a small crew ready. We worked quickly, carrying out couches, tables, and boxes of kitchenware. Every item we moved felt like peeling away another layer of her entitlement. The house emptied fast, replaced by the hollow echo of my own footsteps. When everything was outside the yard, looked like a yard sale no one was invited to. Dresses in garment bags, decorative pillows, and picture frames stacked like bricks. I knew she'd be back late, probably still in her wedding dress. That was part of why I stayed. I wanted her to see in person that choices have consequences. In families, we often let things slide to keep the peace. But peace without respect isn't peace. It's a quiet form of surrender. And I'd surrendered enough over the years to know I was done. It was close to midnight when headlights cut across the driveway. The car door slammed, and there she was, veil askew. Makeup smudged Daniel trailing behind her. She ran to the door, tried the keys, and found they no longer fit. Her voice rose fast, trembling with disbelief. "What happened? Why are my things outside?" I opened the door, met her eyes, and said evenly, "It's my house, Madeline. You're not welcome here anymore." For a second she froze. then stepped forward like she might push past me. But I didn't move, and neither did my friend standing quietly behind me. She tried pleading, switching from anger to desperation. "Please, Ethan, we have nowhere to go." But I thought of every time she'd dismissed me, every careless insult, and the fresh memory of being thrown out of her wedding. "I'm not your brother only when it's convenient," I told her. That was the truth I needed to say, not just for her to hear, but for me to finally believe. She left with Daniel dragging suitcases across the lawn. I closed the door, knowing this wasn't just about protecting my property. It was about reclaiming my dignity, and the next step would make that even clearer. The next morning, my phone rang before sunrise. It was Mom, her voice tight with worry. "Ethan, how could you do that to your sister?" She began, skipping any greeting. She painted a picture of Madeline, stranded, her belongings crammed into a cheap motel room, struggling after the happiest day of her life. I listened quietly, waiting for her to acknowledge what had happened at the wedding. She didn't. Dad's voice joined in on speaker, telling me I'd gone too far. But neither of them had been the one humiliated in front of family and friends. Neither had stood there stripped of dignity. I told them I understood their concern, but I wasn't going to apologize for protecting myself. This wasn't about revenge, I explained. It's about boundaries. You taught me to be generous, but you never said I had to accept being treated like I don't matter. In American families, there's a delicate balance between forgiveness and enabling bad behavior. I'd reached my limit. I thought of friends who had cut ties with toxic relatives, how hard it was, but how much lighter they felt afterward. Sometimes stepping away is the only way to stop a cycle from repeating. After that call, the house felt unusually quiet. No lingering scent of her perfume, no signs of her perfect decorating. It was mine again, empty but peaceful. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the sun spill over the driveway where her belongings had been stacked just hours before. I felt a mix of sadness and relief. You can grieve a relationship even when you know it's healthier to let it go. In fact, that grief is proof you once hoped for something better. But I also knew I'd done what needed to be done for my own well-being. Over the next few weeks, I didn't hear from Madeline. I rented the house to a young couple who treated it and me with respect. Life went on quieter and simpler. Every so often, a family member would try to mediate, but I'd politely decline. I'd seen too many situations where forced reconciliation only reset the clock until the next explosion. What I wanted now wasn't revenge or even an apology, it was peace. And that peace came from knowing I'd finally stood my ground without shouting, without cruelty, just with a firm and necessary no. If there's a lesson in all this, it's that love and respect must go hand in hand. Without both, the bond becomes lopsided, one person giving while the other takes. Setting boundaries doesn't make you unkind. It makes you honest. I don't know if Madeline and I will ever speak again. But I do know this, I'm no longer afraid to protect my space, my work, and my heart. And if you've ever been in my shoes, you know that kind of freedom is worth more than any perfect picture. Looking back, this wasn't just a story about a wedding gone wrong. It was a story about years of unspoken hurt, about the quiet ways we allow ourselves to be diminished, and the moment we finally decide to stop. I didn't change the locks to punish my sister. I did it to protect my dignity. I learned that setting boundaries doesn't mean you love someone less. It means you love yourself enough to stop letting them hurt you. And while the decision cost me a relationship, it gave me something far more valuable, peace that no one can take away. If you've ever been in a situation where family ties felt like chains instead of bonds, you know how hard it is to take that first step toward freedom. It's messy, it's emotional, and it doesn't come with a perfect ending. But the truth is, you don't need a perfect ending, you just need a healthier one. Whether it's a sibling, a parent, or a friend, respect and kindness should always go both ways. And if they don't, it's okay to walk away even from the people you thought would always stand by you. So I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with a family member or someone close? What happened and what did you learn from it? Share your story in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story resonated with you, hit that like button, subscribe for more real-life stories, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for each other is share the truth, even when it's not pretty.